Hello everyone, today we talk about the scientific rebirth of the Low Middle Ages, and this is a topic I particularly love because in spite I'm not an expert on history of science nor history of technology, I still think it's extremely important today to really get this technological aspects right, because modern mindset is kind of has a lot of prejudices relatively to how technology actually works in history. There are many people out there, first of all, are obsessed by technology in the first place, by thinking that everything basically in the history of humanity has progressed because of technology. And this is a very common misconception that it's very hard really to erase. It's one of those hard to die stereotypes that obsess the modernistic mind, that cannot really dissociate, first of all, that always has this idea of progress, most of all. So even very often these prejudices relatively to the obscurity, let's say, of such historical periods, the Middle Ages still suffer unjustifiably of such, I cannot think a better term to define it, but idiotic misconceptions, because a person who thinks that the Middle Ages were a dark age, or at least that they were darker than other areas in history, should be ashamed of him or herself, especially in 2019. Secondly, if people bothered to actually read a bit of history of technology proper, or just studying a bit of sociology, or maybe even a history of economics that takes such things into consideration, perfectly knows that technology is almost never the triggering factor of a certain, let's call it progress in the non-teleological way of the term. This prejudice is very widespread, essentially because the idea is that a person invents, or better, discovers a technology. Discovers a technology out of nothing, as if technologies were things that, I don't know, were on these video games you had to fulfill certain tasks to eventually unlock that technology that was suspended there in the air somewhere. And that progress follows, because with that technology you can do everything and society progresses and all. While in actual fact, there are technologies who are able to do that, but let's say that all technology can do that, but it's usually, on average, a minimal part of the whole thing. What actually triggers the discovery, the invention of technologies and their application is actually the same request for them. Technologies don't pop out magically of nowhere and get employed because nobody had thought about them before. Technologies are something that is requested for a system that has a particular need. So to satisfy that particular need, it's like with the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, we get kind of the best example, because it was something that indeed marked a very sharp change, at least in relatively to what had been the pace of technology development in previous parts of history. Not because someone invented steam engine. Steam engine was known since the ancient times, and everybody through the Middle Ages as well was perfectly aware that steam could have this force that could be applied. What happens in the 18th century England, by the way, because you have always to, it's not even a matter of time, it's really a matter of society, fixed society in mind. England at the time was fastly rising in terms of, especially it was expanding as a colonial empire, was getting an overload essentially of raw material coming to Britain through the colonies, chiefly cotton, and basically these great English businessmen realized that basically the human labor force was insufficient to basically in terms of sheer, individuals, of single people working, to work all that cotton, and that would have been a shame to waste. So it's at that point that they find out the solution by exploiting this technology. It was already known, that is steam engine, but kind of building finally a system that could really use that force in an effective way, with all the components, statistics especially, that only by the time with 18th century technology could be provided. So you have to think of this spin-off of all other satellite activities that were there in England at the time, and begin to use this mechanic looms, as it's known, that begin to work with steam. At the beginning it was mixed. It wasn't just steam machinery obviously doing all the work, but really increasing in this sense the production by mechanizing it. So many people get confused and get this wrong and that's how basically the Industrial Revolution starts. And then obviously that produces in turn more wealth for these people who are able to invest in other activities, and that's what makes the improvement. So invest even in other technologies. So it's not that technologies can be discovered, figured out in, let's say, at a point in history where they have essentially no way of being applied practically, that find no application. There are technologies that are found at a certain point in history, and that for maybe even 1 century they can't find an adequate implementation because society doesn't support that. So many people say, oh well, look, the Greeks back in the day had invented the steam engine and had figured that out. So why it wasn't used? Well, well, there are many reasons. First of all, at the time, many people find this explanation like it was the Romans, right? Because the Romans were not interested in technology, and maybe not even the Greeks. And first explanation is, oh well, because they had slavery at the time. So they did everything with slaves. Yes and no. That's not a matter of slavery in itself. The Romans, for instance, as well as the Greeks, built and other ancient civilizations built a lot of huge monuments, including, I don't know, the pyramids of Giza or the Colosseum, with salaried workers. So yeah, okay, you could discuss where let's think about what the market could be, how convenient it was. Yeah, that was it. It was more convenient. And it was more convenient, and people get it wrong all the time. They think, oh well, they were stupid essentially because they kept using slaves or human labor force without using the steam engine, because we're stupid, right? And we moderns are so intelligent. No, dear, you are the stupid, and you're the stupid exactly because you're a modern person. Those people perfectly knew the steam engine and perfectly knew that they didn't have satellite activities, let's say, a spin-off to apply that for making essentially an industrial revolution happening. They would have thought rightfully that would have been a folly to do something like that, because simply the ancient world didn't have the economical potential to put up an industrial revolution. It didn't have, as we were saying, the spin-off. It didn't have all these satellite activities. They didn't have all these things that would have triggered the technology that was even needed for making steam engines work as we think like today. The ancient world knew steam engine, but they didn't have, for instance, the way of containing all these other components to, for instance, compressing steam. That is something that starts happening, in fact, from the 17th. That in Western was start having from the 17th, the 18th century, because society was much wealthier than one of the ancient world. And they could apply those without particular economical effort, and having in there a convenience with a structure that could afford that to happen. In the ancient world, applying the steam engine for ships, for other machinery, would have simply made everyone starving to death. It's like what happened in Mao's China, with a great leap forward. Basically, one day these great geniuses of the Chinese Popular Republic decided to impose to every single Chinese village the construction of certain iron ovens in every single village, because those had to basically melt and produce iron, essentially. So they were forced, imposed this idea: okay, you're a bunch of peasants that don't know technology, now you get those ovens and you produce iron for us. Result: 20 million Chinese starving to death at least. We actually think that there were much more than them, even up to 40 or 50 million people. This is the magics of technology, right? And let's say, or better, I love technology, and without technology we would. But this is the splendid result of technologistical ideologies, for this mental illness, for which everything has to be solved by technology. Okay. Technology can solve things, but only if you have something that allows you to create that technology in the first place, and if you are interested to do so. And you have to think that in this sense, humans they give a price even to their own lives. This is something strange to say, but it is indeed true, because today we know actually lots of things, scientifically speaking, but the problem is that we cannot apply them, because either people are not interested, either it's not really convenient, because if it's something convenient, there is always someone who's going to speculate out of them. Maybe it takes a genius, a person who is particularly versed for it, and so it is. So all this big introduction and complaint about technologistical prejudices, first of all, to say that the Middle Ages were not a moment of technological stagnation, but most of all to say that the Middle Ages were not a moment into which it sufficed that technology and everything would have battered out of the blue, or that was the obscurantistic church that oppressed anyone and didn't make the poor scientific research happening, because that has always happened in spite of what everyone thought. Indeed, sober structural ideologies can stem technology in great part, but on a macrostructural level, you cannot. The history of civilization teaches us that if something works, people are going to use it. Doesn't matter what. And there is always someone who's going to profit from it. Even the greatest, authorities who are supposedly. In fact, this is another prejudice that we get wrong all the time. Like Galileo's trial. Well, that was a thing. Obviously, we are in modern age, not in Middle Ages, but that is always often taken as that poor guy was put under trial and was obliged basically to obdurate, I don't know how to say it, to retract basically his scientific theories that he had got right. By the way, also following other astronomers that had already discovered, obviously, that the Earth revolves under the Sun and not vice versa. But just think about it at the time. What that meant. I mean, what was the actual application at the time of this knowledge? That it was the Earth revolving around the Sun, and not the contrary. and people get it as if, you know, the church at that time was oppressive and was stemming scientific progress. If you look at that, what kind of progress that it was a mostly theoretical progress that was achieved. Obviously, it was important to study the stars at the time to get also a lot of other celestial bodies to actually get another. But you know what? What was the real application compared to what the church was doing, for instance, from an educational point of view? Because the church at the time, during the Counter-Reformation, was actually reforming really educational systems. It was getting people more literate. It was getting people more aware of the religion that they professed. Whereas in previous centuries, many people also remained pretty, just taking what they were told and not really studying by themselves. The Inquisition Tribunals at the time, that in these modernistic perspectives are considered some of the, like the hell on earth, etc., actually sent to death much less people than what normal tribunals were doing, even for similar ideological reason. Secular tribunals of every single European state at the time, anyway. And they were, by the way, probably the only really guarantistic tribunal that existed out there. It means that the imputee had, the accused, the indicted, was actually granted certain rights that were untouchable until the person was not condemned, which didn't happen in other secular tribunals. So Galileo's great figure. I love Galileo's personally. I've also read some of his works, and he was an amazing mind, and you cannot but appreciate the guy. But when you consider the whole thing from this ideological perspective, by saying that, he was the truth of the science of the progress. By the way, these people at the time still had very disturbing beliefs in the first place, even if he had discovered that the earth revolved around the sun. I mean, it's not a person you would be confident to talk with or to discuss moral things, for instance, today. So you don't have to idealize these figures as the pure thinkers that were such good people ante litteram, and while the rest of the world was a bunch of oppressive obscurantist people, because this is the narrative that sometimes you get. And it's a completely, in universities, naturally, this perspective does not exist. I hope that many of the people who actually believe this are aware of the situation, because these are things that I personally read for the first time only when I got on the internet, and I have to be honest, and that's why I really I was shocked actually to see the mass degree of ignorance that there is towards such topics. And the worst thing, and what I want to talk about today, about medieval science proper, is actually dispelling other myths concerning the fact that technology is a thing you basically have to read a book for finding it out. There is this other gigantic myth of people who conceive the Middle Ages as a dark hole, as a flatland where nothing happened, where people were standardly ignorant, and they didn't read, they didn't travel, they didn't know anything. At a certain point, some magic book came from the East, and they started finding out this extraordinary knowledge of the ancient, and pop out, and the Renaissance pops out. Right? Because most people are genuinely convinced of this. Most people today are genuinely convinced that the Middle Ages basically progressed because, medieval society progressed and turned into the modern society. It's another very disturbing ideological way of conceiving history. Because they read the book of the ancients. Well, first of all, the medievals have continuously read the books of the ancient, and to be honest, the science of the ancients, it is true, and today we will see it came back mostly, actually much before the late Middle Ages. Actually, the scientific revival of the Low Middle Ages is something that starts even from the 10th century to the 13th in the first wave. So, well before the Renaissance, first of all. Secondly, you can't say that this is virtually relative in the sense that, and this is what I really care about here to make really the point on, is that here we're talking chiefly about the Western world. Okay, so we're conceiving the perspective of Western Europe, not the one of Byzantium and of the Islamic world, that instead had preserved that knowledge, it's uncountable, and started, and the Westerners kind of took it back from them at a certain point. But what it is crucial to understanding here, it's not that the Westerners at a certain point were civilized by these peoples by simply reading these things and becoming intelligent from a day to another and being able to absorb those ideas. It was the same Westerners who went in the East for taking those books back and that knowledge back for them, which is something excruciatingly important, because it means that these people in the West already knew, first of all, there was that knowledge in there. They knew how it could serve to them, because evidently they had problems to solve that they knew there were people out there that already knew something about it. And by the way, also in here, you don't have to imagine, I don't know, like the Byzantines and the Islamic and the Muslims, like dancing around saying, oh, we have this knowledge, we can do everything now, we're so advanced, etc. Technology was pretty homogeneous in there, both in the East and in the West. Most of these books were stored into libraries that were accessible, but sometimes were libraries of court. The West, in this sense, both in Roman times and in medieval times, actually had a much more effervescent and dynamic approach to knowledge than in the East. In the East, there were these huge libraries that, however, were like warehouses, stock houses of books where only a few literate went there studying. In the West, people read books on their own at a capillary level. This has been always a great, really a great characteristics that has differentiated the East and the West, which is strange because even in the ancient world, actually the most developed, intellectually developed areas were the one of the Eastern of the East, let's say, while the Romans, the Latins, were a bit rougher by culture. But in actual fact, the Romans in the West went much more into libraries, reading. Obviously, there were public readings, there weren't really individual things, but still people did that autonomously. While in the East, basically, these libraries stayed, as we're saying, into the royal palace, into the, the sanctuary of that deity, and a very few people went there. Nobody actually practically read them. And so it was also in the West, in the Middle Ages, because the Western world was literally exploding at this time of the 11th to 12th century, while the Byzantine society was crystallizing. There was not the dynamism of the West from a intellectual, from a technological point of view. By the 12th century, the West fills basically all the intellectual and technological gaps that were with the East at this point. Probably the Islamic world was also more intellectually vivacious than the Byzantine one at this time, because the Muslims had a different approach. They had a different society. It starts always from the society. It's not really about. This is the eternal illusion that technology is a matter of just knowing it. No, you need to have a structure on which you can implement it. Why did the West rose so quickly at this time? Because the cities were flourishing. There were people, the middle classes, who needed to trade, who needed to make accounts, they needed to build, castles, they needed to build trebuchet, they needed to make, and these were all the needs that triggered the absorption of technology that, by the way, and this is also another key point to understand it, were already partly known. Do you think that the Westerners began to build castles and to build trebuchet, and surpassing eventually in technology powers like Byzantium, for instance, because they read a book? These people read books when they had already figured out basically everything, and they just wanted a theoretical comfort, let's say, from an intellectual point of view, to maybe have a more theoretical and systematic approach to the subject, even to teach it to other people. But the technologies were already there. Technologies do not wait a guy who comes there with a manual and teaches you how it happens. Technology already pop out. And this need for books eventually was chiefly for giving an education on a more structural level, so being able to replicate those technologies even without being a strictly one of those people who, these craftsmen that already did that for a living. And you also have to think another point, very important point, and most of the so-called scientific material at this time wasn't actually about science, say, as we think about it, let's say technology proper. You have to think that 90% of what those people thought was science was actually magic, or however, I can't really say this because we'll see that magic is something that develops, but let's say first of all there is, let's put it in this way, it was this conception of the world was magic already by standard. This is something that came straight from the ancient world, by the way. The ancient world was this world where people were rational and secular and thought only scientific things. Erased that. The ancient world was extremely superstitious, they believed in magic anyhow, and most of their so-called science was actually only, and this is the point I want to say, is actually about philology. Okay? These were mostly compilative descriptions of reality. Even if you take the great knowledge of the ancient world, you realize that it's like a bit with medicine. Medicine is a good example also because medicine comes back into this moment as well as one of the major disciplines that Westerners were interested in. Medicine, if you look at medicine, sometimes we say, "Oh, the ancients already knew that in back in the day that medicine or that thing worked well." But if you really look at what the whole medicine was, it was like a 5% that actually worked, and the other 95% being a whole load of pure fantasy, practically. So we can say, oh, that 5%, yeah, okay, but you don't consider the rest. So it was in the Middle Ages, and if you look actually at the knowledge that existed into these times, you realize that it was pretty homogeneous. It's not that at a certain point the ancient world ends and the Middle Ages start and everybody becomes poor and ignorant. Also in here, it's a matter of needs, okay? What was needed in medieval society? Well, people tried to find out a solution. There were different, even the Germanic peoples, for instance, were passed for these brute destructors that didn't know anything and needed to be civilized by the Mediterranean world, were, as a matter of fact, actually pretty advanced on certain things on their own. Yeah, of course, I'm not saying that the Germans were illiterate, they were ignorant, to say plain and simple, but, I don't know, for instance, their let's say they were all about war, right? And their surgery was actually pretty advanced for the time. There were certain things the Germans could do that at least they did. Maybe the Roman world knew about, but that they even did better than the Roman world. So never think as, and why? Because in their culture, in their environment, they had to deal with that more frequently. You know, if you find it a society like the Germanic one in this semi-nomadic world of Central and Eastern Europe that fights all the time, because there are no other resources to actually grow sedentary on a prolonged base, and basically you need all this raiding and bloodshed and all, you're a much more violent society than the one of the Mediterranean world, that instead it's sedentary, it's pacified because there is a state that can feed the population, that keep the order good. So it means that maybe the elites of the empire know, and definitely there are medicians, etc., who know how to cure that wound. But that's something they don't do on a regular basis. Of course, in the Roman army there were such doctors that could do that. But in a society as a whole, the Germans, let's say, were much more used to solve those problems because it happened much more frequently than in these other more Pacific societies of the South. Just to make you an example of how technology practically works. So also in the Middle Ages, you don't have to think that this technology is something that structures, I don't know, that unlocks other levels of civilization. It was something very progressive. It was mixed, actually. It was a very slow, let's say, process that was triggered by necessities that were backed also by other knowledge that already existed, and that only needed a little bit to basically to recompose the whole picture, and because and there was the intellectual curiosity. This is also a very great point I have to make. It's why did the Westerners begin at this point between the 10th and the 13th century to take all these manuscripts back, say, from the East? Because they go actively taking them. First of all, because they knew they were there. They had a culture, they had an education, they knew where to search, etc. But also, they had a surplus. I mean, these, for medieval standards, doesn't matter whether the West, the Byzantine, or the Islamic world, such studies were kind of a privilege. The economy was mostly a survival rate one, but the reason why there are people now that from all over Europe began to read these manuscripts, to copy them, to translate them from Arab, from Greek, is that there is enough surplus in Europe with this revival of the period in economical and demographical terms, that are able to invest that surplus into education. So it's not that before that period where the situation was a bit grimmer, people didn't care about technology. They simply found solutions that were kept to be found at this point all the time, because we see only what was written in the manuscripts, but you have to think of, like, at the point of an iceberg, that there is a huge amount of knowledge about which we don't know anything because it was not written down at the time. It was mostly, by the way, the actual practical knowledge. So the one that was actually spread among the society and that people used for a living, literally. But no, we get this elitist idea that is typical, by the way, also of the modern and of modernistic prejudices, because there is one guy that essentially can get educated and can say, okay, I'm superior because I have this theoretical knowledge that is, been handed down to me by the authorities of the past, and starts building a sort of an ideology surrounding it, which is the typical elitistic attitude of the Renaissance, and the typical elitistic attitude of those who ignorantly believe today that before such figures or such books did not exist. I don't know, it was the Middle Ages was a dark hole of ignorance, and nobody knew anything, and they were so primitive and incapable of any progress whatsoever. And that has distorted, in fact, our view of technology in this sense, and makes us believe that if something is not written on a book, then it doesn't exist, or that people do not know things. And this is a terrible mistake if you want to learn history, because as a matter of fact, and this is like the ABC of people who study these things today at an academic level, we perfectly know that behind the books were actually just in fact, the tip of the iceberg. And that from the same books, this theoretical systematization, we know that there was a whole world behind this. So even these authors that remain famous that today we will talk about, think about Gerard of Cremona, actually tell us that behind the theoretical systematization there was something done even for the sake of, I don't know, sometimes, I don't know if you've ever read these books, it's obvious, you can, even at a first glance, you can understand that there is a great deal of abstraction in what they were talking about. Well, besides these books, there was a whole world of experimentation, of craftsmen, of people who knew how to they were illiterate. Think about, and this is an example I always like to make, about the 18th century journey of Peter the Great of Russia into the Netherlands. So Peter the Great of Russia wanted to build up a Russian navy at the time. That was his main concern, because he had understood that a modern Russia had to have an access to the Baltic Sea, and they had to fight against the Swedes and all. The problem is that Russians, in this sense, didn't have a great deal of maritime interests, first of all. So I can't say of knowledge in this sense, because otherwise I would go against my own theories. So, however, they hadn't had a need up to that time. Up to the time, in fact, there was a solid central Russian state that Peter was building to venture into the seas. And what he does, he was passionate about naval engineering. He projects this journey into the Netherlands and Venice, that were the most advanced countries at the time for naval technology. He goes to the Netherlands, and he wanted to read books on how to build a ship. And he discovers that these Dutch naval engineers weren't building ships by reading books. That was simply an art that they handed down generation by generation, and that was it. So think about what all those people could have written down, and that we haven't in that measure by that time. Then of course, there were certain Dutch engineers who wrote at the time. But most of the actual process into which those extremely advanced Dutch ships were built was non-written. So this was all a practical know-how, and that's what it worked. That's how it worked like. That's extremely important to understand. Then he wanted to go to Venice, where instead there were more treatises and all. The Venetian galleys were something very important. In fact, the same Russians actually built up galleys even into the Baltic Sea, and they were pretty effective against the Swedes at the time. It was said had other naval technologies, but eventually he had to come back to Russia, so he didn't make it to Venice. But just to make you understand how what we see before the age of, let's say, especially the age of the Enlightenment, but even up to today, telling the truth, of our most recent times, where scholarization got, let's say, at a mass level, so with mass education, so we're roughly at the end of the 19th century, and especially in the 20th century, people carried out things, without even being literate. So without even writing books or knowing how to read them. So if you want to understand why in the 12th century the Italians, for instance, were on the lead on naval engineering, military engineering, siege warfare, and all, you don't have to understand it as if those were soaked, I don't know, with Arab or Greek knowledge that triggered that, because they had already figured out on their own. And at that point, it's them, however, that being more educated, more literate, for social and economical reasons, and also political ones in part, start to say, okay, now we know how to build this, but can we perfect our knowledge? Let's go take those books that we have seen in Constantinople or in Alexandria of Egypt while we were trading in there, and that we know that they are there. And I started reading them, and I started creating these systemizations. This partly triggers a phenomenon, as we were saying, of elitism. So in 12th century, we talk sometimes of the 12th century revival, or Renaissance even. I made even a video about that. But it's a bit what happened on a more structural level with the Renaissance. That were a bunch of elite people who studied, that, yes, were often connected even with practical knowledge. Think about Leonardo da Vinci, but say that some certain humanists at that point were more keen on actually literary stuff than practical knowledge. The best example also this time comes for medicine. Think about medicine. This is a pretty standard example. Medicine up to I think the 18th century was about a matter of pure theoretical things. That means that doctors never touched their patients, or at least some did, especially in those more, say, freer countries. I must say, telling the truth in this, well, I won't say that because otherwise I will get in a fix now. It's better that I don't even hint at what I was about to say. But what I say is that there were the doctors and there are the surgeons. So the surgeons were even people like barbers, for instance, while the doctor was the doctor was the guy who studied at the university, that studied over the Greek texts of the Greek authorities, etc., and maybe didn't even touch blood. Those who actually fixed people were these surgeons, these barbers, the obstetricians. A greatly overlooked chapter of Western medicine in this time was in fact one of women who helped other women giving birth, and that were depreciated, were treated with contempt. First of all, because they were women, because at the time women were considered inferior human beings. Because Aristotle had said, in fact, the Greek authority were more stupid because they had this was the reason, according to them, that the women having narrower shoulders had less blood coming to their head and therefore were more stupid. This was the kind of society that really, you think it was modern and advanced. Keep thinking this. And instead, obstetricians, these women were extremely important. They saved a lot of women's and children's life during the caring, while doctors were completely ignorant about such things, and they treated them with contempt, and sometimes they did very stupid things on those women who had to give birth to babies by applying stupid notions that I had read from books that had been written 2,000 years before, just because that was the authority that I had read on books. So this is not technology, this is not progress, and today, unfortunately, we know at universities that women had that obstetricians had this. Obstetricians were all women basically at this time, because only it wasn't conceived a good thing that a man a woman private parts and assisted her in that way. So they were all women, So these women who did this outstanding job, but at that time were mistreated and contempted. Well, telling the truth, I must say this, that especially the noblemen preferred men and surgeons and doctors to make their wives delivering babies. And certain nobles were even offended when there were women that wanted to help their wives giving birth, while the majority of the population, because they thought that women had a sort of negative influx on the baby, that they had all these weird conceptions, etc. But the average of the population, so the everyday people, so what really makes the average of a society and of a civilization, had these extremely important obstetricians instead carrying out that job. And I don't know, prejudices towards women maybe were still there, but at least they knew that that worked, because obstetricians had this great experience and knowledge that doctors didn't have. So it was all very complicated now. It's also, I don't want to generalize, because I realize now I made a lot of approximation in terms of where and when, because even societies were very different, so I'm not saying that this were all over, but this was just a good example to say that, practical knowledge at a certain point was despised because of this elitistic modern contempt for practical things, and was instead all concentrated on theory. This was also a typical Greek prejudices of the ancient world. The Greeks were the greatest thinkers of the ancient world, but sometimes they were completely theoretical about it. Today we will be talking, for instance, also about the Ptolemy's work of Atlas and thing. Basically, Ptolemy's, just to make you understand how the Greek mind worked, he had created this extremely complex system of coordinates for basically locating all the various cities of the world at the time on a map. So he had made this huge theoretical effort by considering, when the sun set down, or all the distances, or the lights, or the shadows, and all these clocks that already existed at the time, to create a system basically of coordinates. And he seemingly didn't even put these coordinates on a map. So it's not that this guy needed that for creating a map to use. This was just a pure theoretical thing to say, okay, I carried that out from a theoretical point of view, and I achieved it, I'm satisfied. This was the Greek mindset. So even think about all these Greek manuscripts that came, these Greek works that at the time, however, we will see it, had been enriched by even Arab and Indian and even Chinese knowledge that had really added a lot even to the ancient Greek thing. In fact, the Westerners got these Greek works actually mediated. They didn't get the originals, they got the Arab translations that also informed these works with other conceptions of the world and other beliefs, etc. So even the West was influenced by this by the time, and that added something even more practical, because the Arabs were more practically minded. But it's a bit like the Romans. The Romans were, this is also another great example. The Greeks had this enormous intellectual development, and the Romans hadn't. But the Romans were the ones that, thanks to their structure, to the fact that they had built an empire, even conquering these Greek territories and all, and absorbing obviously their civilization, their knowledge, etc. However, they weren't excessively interested about theoretical aspects, but about practical ones. The Romans built, in fact, all these enormous infrastructures that we can still see in Europe and North Africa and Near East by practical needs. They didn't care to speculate like the Greeks did. They just carried it out. So it was there are cultural influences here that are important to consider. But I want you to not to fall into the mistake of considering the these technological improvements as something that came straight from a theoretical thing that could immediately make civilization advance, because this never happened ever. Quite often, those who could apply that knowledge were already more advanced than the actual knowledge in itself. At least from a practical point of view, they already knew how to do it. And now they I can't say that it's even they are two different steps. I mean, this progress went together with the rediscovery of this knowledge. So I want you also to consider this. It's not that the Westerners invented it all before and then they just checked those books. It was something that went in parallel. But what I mean is that it would have not been possible to do it in the first place if there had not been a pre-ordered base, in this sense, that could allow them to even to read those books and to know that they were there. So this is quite of a big premise. A lot of I don't know if I should go on with the. Well, let's try this. It can be interesting to do anyway. It's gonna be a very long video, I hope, but I'll try to be quick now. So, as I was saying, even the canonic date of the rebirth of the West, it's not the Renaissance, it's not even the 12th century, it's something that started even before, roughly around the 10th century. That is in fact the moment that into which especially the Western European civilization begins to expand once again, especially from an economical point of view. And the idea is that there is a renewed contact with the Byzantine world, also with the great Arab-Islamic civilization. So, which were the places that actually saw the rise of such the first interaction, the first absorption of this knowledge? Well, they were mostly in the Mediterranean. So this happened in areas into which in fact the Western culture and the Islamic one were more in touch. That is, Spain was half of Spain was in the hands of the Arabs now, if not more. Sicily, that gets reconquered by the Normans, but had been Islamic, and the Holy Land, of course, that was Islamic in part, and so that was straight at the core. So this interaction was further implemented by the trade relations that existed into the Mediterranean by war. This is something I insist very much, having created this military history channel, because war is the perfect hybrider of civilizations. In spite of its potentially its greater destructor. So the Crusaders also learn from their enemies, also in tactics and siege warfare and all. And there is especially this, and this produces in turn an overflow in the West of texts and knowledge, really on a great scale. So up to the half of the 12th century, there was an equipe of cultured people who basically began the translation of such books. It was an equipe, especially that was encouraged by the Abbey of Cluny, Peter the Venerable, was a great figure. Also in here, he was mostly a religious figure. He was one of the greatest authorities of his time. He was especially interested in restored monastic life, He visited a lot of monasteries. This process is very important because during these visits, books that were stored into monasteries circulated. The story that books in the Middle Ages remained closed into the monasteries is completely false. Books traveled a lot. People read it. Even non-religious people read it. In the monastery, libraries were accessible to laymen since a very early age. So this flat idea of the Middle Ages where people just stored books and didn't read them is another idiotic prejudice. He was great friend to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. So this great. It was the times of the Crusades, essentially. And he was appreciated by sovereigns and pontiffs. So he also had this interesting relation between the top and the bottom of the ecclesiastical hierarchy that, in this sense, facilitated also the exchange of knowledge. And he was against heresies, for instance. He greatly debated. He wrote actually he had a lot of contact actually also with the Muslims. He went to Spain, as a matter of fact. This is the major achievements in around 1114 to translate the Quran in Latin. He wrote also things against the Jews. So yeah, we have to think of a world that is very different from ours, and we have to understand a lot of ideologies also that are disturbing for us in some measure. But it was still a person really with great sensibility. This is another prejudice we get about the Middle Ages, that if a person owns, a bit like today, if a person owns bad ideas, he's a fully bad person. Well, it's not really so. Human nature is extremely complex to scope in this sense. You can be an assassin, but still, I don't know, being an extremely prolific person from an intellectual point of view. So we're not interested in whether you're bad or good now. We're talking about history of technology. So what we're interested in is even the intellectual sensitivity of these people. And we know he wrote a lot of things, a lot of letters, even against his own enemies. He actually was pretty much against Abelard. At the time, there was all controversy at the time. Probably you've heard about the story of Abelard and Eloise and all. And he actually gave asylum to these enemies of his. He comforted Eloise after Abelard's death. I mean, he wasn't that bad. And he's... he wasn't that bad. I mean, I'm sorry, it's a stupid judgment, but he was a complex person. And the mind complexity is something very important to understand intellectual development. And we owe to him this translation of the Quran. So this was also the moment, Peter the Venerable died in around, I think he died like in the 50s of the 12th century. So he didn't make it to 1187, when roughly around this time Aristotle comes back to circulate all over Europe. Another point in here, I discussed it partly. I never made a video about the scholastics proper, but think about this idea of the intellectual oppression of the alleged intellectual oppression of the Middle Ages. The scholastics system was built actually to respond to the fact that everywhere in Europe people were reading Aristotle. This happened between the 12th and the 13th century. So even in Paris, there was the most Christian, and it was the greatest theologian school of Western Christianity. Everybody was reading Aristotle, that at that time was considered by the church a dangerous author, because Aristotle had presented this extremely complex physics and metaphysics that was seen indeed as a huge perfect system, and Aristotle taken into consideration as a great authority. But he had not been integrated into the Christian thought, whereas instead Platonism in part had been done, or at least there was a greater, the Westerners were a bit more used to Plato than Aristotle, even if that also had to be studied by that time. But Aristotle at this point was read everywhere. So the concern of the church was not to stem, they tried to stem to prevent these even priests and theologians that teach at the university to read this, but they kept reading that. So the great measure of actually open-mindedness of the Middle Ages is how the church at this point is able to integrate Aristotle in the Christian physics and metaphysics, and how to instead makes it its own. So the Ptolemaic Aristotelian system is something that lasts still, since before we were talking about Galileo's, and that's a point. Excuse me, I drink a little. So this is for saying that really knowledge in the Middle Ages circulated widely. And sure, the average medieval person didn't read Aristotle, but say up to the 18th century also the average European person up to the 19th actually didn't go to school either. So what are we complaining about? I mean, let's be fair and honest about certain things. So there is this other so a key point of this is also understanding that people traveled a lot in the Middle Ages. So another let's say wandering figure, I don't know how to say it in English, an itinerant figure that was extremely important for spreading knowledge, etc. We named it before. It's Gerard from Cremona. So Gerard from Cremona, he basically went to Spain to study. He went to Toledo, and he found an amazing quantity of treatises about logics, optics, geometry. One point, though, was that they were all written in Arab. So what he does, this guy from northern Italy, he learns Arab and translates them. So, and he starts translating all of this. And Gerard of Cremona is actually an incredible figure. He is this major translator of the time. Is these scientific works from Arab to Latin. And he had gone to Spain actually to study the Almagestri of Ptolemy. So this is very important, because you think, these guys, what was he doing in Spain? He knew that there were people studying Ptolemy's work in there, and from northern Italy, this guy in the 12th century moves to Spain and starts studying and translating all these texts from Arab to Latin. And he translates, so you say this person had already to have an education, a knowledge, an interest, a reason for doing that. So they weren't brutes that came out from the darkness of the dark ages and that were enlightened by these things. They already knew they were there. They already knew what use they could do of that. So Gerard translates all these works of astronomy, astrology, arithmetics, algebra, geometry, geomancy, philosophy, medicine, okay, all from Arab, and also in part from Greek, telling the truth. For instance, also Aristotle, Gerard translated the Analytica Posteriora and the Physica of Aristotle. So think also about translating the Arab texts. As I was saying before, the Arab texts had been all written by these great figures of the Muslim world, these great thinkers like Al-Farghani or Jabir ibn Aflah, Ibn al-Haytham, Avicenna. So a couple of days ago, it would be more than 1 week now, I made a video about 9th 12th century Islamic thought, Mu'tazilism, Ismailism, and Sufism, in which I discuss also about these authors in part. So if you're interested and you want to know more of what I'm talking about, you can check that out. So so what I was saying is that it requires also, these books are not simple works. A translation is not just something mechanical. This was not just a scribe. Gerard was something more, and you need to understand what you're translating in order to translate it. So if these people didn't know these things before, how could they understand it? They already did. So was the Middle Ages or this dark thing people believe? Gerard's from Cremona's work was of huge importance for Western Europe to actually integrate the Arab scientific achievements and through these works also of Greek science, of ancient Greek science. But it was all a world that was asking for them. In some measure, in great measure actually. So so what about the point actually of these things that had this knowledge that had been lost? It had been lost. Let's be honest about it. The Western world hadn't known these works for centuries. We don't have to think these people knew it all before. I don't want to leave you with this thought. But it's still the idea that the West was not isolated, that it was perfectly aware that it was a past from which they could learn something. And even if they had been, up to this time, say, relatively backwards especially in say, great systems of knowledge in some form, compared obviously to Constantinople and Islam, they, however, soon compensate this gap and go even beyond for the reasons we were talking about before, chiefly social and economical ones. And political as well, because I forget that, but even politics is important. For instance, at this time the Byzantine Empire in some places was trying to basically develop a bit like the Italian city-states. There were certain cities that wanted to emancipate themselves from the central government of Constantinople. Constantinople was very strong and manages to keep these guys down, keeps to control society. It manages to kind of control the thing, to impose its view of its ideological conception of the imperial rule, etc. And this, in part, stems development. So even politics here is important. It's not just about the societies are without a guide. And as a consequence, Constantinople kind of crystallizes in its thought, loses that elasticity that had characterized itself in the previous centuries. It gets enclosed into its sense of intellectual superiority that was lost in the moment into which they began to think they were better than anyone else, instead of trying to actually understand the others, that had been what had made the Byzantine Empire great up to that point. And what happens unavoidably is that the West surpasses them. And so it happens. And it's even a matter of political models and all. And there were actually certain Byzantine minds that understood this. Even great politicians like Manuel Comnenus that tried to westernize the empire a little bit, but there was a strong reaction. This is also important. I always tell that. Usually I talk about it relatively to the migration era, but sometimes a civilization that has less knowledge tends to be more open to knowledge. This worked for the Germans, this worked for the Arabs, and now the Westerners that already had actually massive, by this point, the 12th century, they had a strong traditions, so strong ideological developments and culture and etc. They are, however, very open to this new information, to this new knowledge, because their society is relatively more egalitarian. For instance, the fragmentation of Europe is important at this time. Those who were mostly interested in this Eastern knowledge were the most advanced communities, were usually these independent city-states who had classes of commoners who in this sense didn't have to fit into, I don't know, an aristocratic stereotype and to believe only in certain things. They were practical people. We will see it, especially with Fibonacci now at the end, that this knowledge wasn't taken for idealistic purposes. It was eventually also Western Europe, especially during the late Middle Ages, kind of crystallizes, and not surprisingly, humanism pops out. The Renaissance, and with its elitism, pops out. That, of course, the West remains effervescent and dynamic, technologically speaking, but it partly also society, the Ancien regime crystallizes as in social terms, and there is a fallout of that also in certain ways of how culture was accessed. Most of all, for instance, universities at this time were something extremely free. The first universities I really never made. Yeah, I think I made a video about universities, but never how they were actually born. At this time, were a bunch of guys paying a lawyer to teach them law. They went outdoors teaching. It was in the later Middle Ages. The university is something squared with all a program that you had to learn only those books. The teachers were untouchable, you couldn't interact. So there is even, especially in the higher echelons of society, this elitism and dogmatism that kicks in. But this very first movement, especially in the 12th century, was extremely free, dynamic. It didn't have a tunnel vision. It was open to everything. It wasn't narrow-minded. It wasn't stemmed. It wasn't blocked. So an extreme, probably the most important. So as we were saying also before, all this knowledge that was coming from this was also relatively new in medieval standards in the first place. This wasn't just classical knowledge. Plain and simple, how it had been handed down from the ancient world. This was enriched with a huge quantity of notions, coming chiefly from these great civilizations of Persia, India, and in a mediated way also from China. So all through Islam, actually, that had this great philosophy on its own, that had been thinking a lot. So there are new elements. Especially medicine, mathematics, and astronomy were much more advanced in many ways compared to the ancient world. So this other myth that it was just about recovering the ancient knowledge, it's not completely true. The medievals added a lot in terms of even of certain, and certain practical technologies that were created into the Middle Ages were actually more advanced in part. I mean, they weren't substantially something else, but there were progressive, certain technologies were better from the ancient world. The ancient world couldn't build Gothic cathedrals. Siege machinery of the Middle Ages was more effective than the one of the ancient world, but in this sense here it's not being inferior or superior, simply that medievals had other needs compared to the ancient ones, so they figured out different solutions. There were actually a series of things, including, think about armor, metallurgy. Metallurgy was much more advanced in the Middle Ages than in the ancient world, at least from a certain point onwards. We're talking about low Middle Ages now, so yeah, it fits. So it is true that by standards, the Middle Ages didn't add structurally and massively anything new to the ancient knowledge, but it was at the same level practically. You have to wait until the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th century, especially, to see, well, it began slowly from, actually also from the 16th, but it's basically, you will say firearms. Yeah, okay, but firearms didn't, that's another prejudice, and I will make military history themed videos about that. It's not that firearms changed things from one day to another. It took like say 400 years before you pass to the linear tactics with musketeers and from a medieval army. Okay, so it's not about firearms. Firearms, erase this thing that technology changes things radically. Firearms didn't change radically at all, nothing. Do not buy Parker's theory of the military revolution, because that's utter rubbish. Okay, that's, today nobody believes in it anymore, I can assure you. In academy, then out of the academy you can say whatever you want, but I think the academy has some degree of, let's say, of quality attached, at least on average, compared to the rest of the world. The academy can be wrong as well, but if you neither know what is being told in the academy, don't distrust the academy in the first place. Distrust the academy only when it's, you can fact check that what it's saying is wrong. If you neither know what it says, do not buy into the stereotypes, because it's just plain stupid. So I don't remember what I was saying, but I was saying that, oh yeah, that that more or less the medieval technology was on the same level, same ground of the ancient one. This is it. However, what the medievals went actually far ahead compared to the ancient world was optics. Yeah, I know, it's only that, most of all from a massive point of view, from a structural point of view, but it's already something. And that's not to be underestimated as such. This time there are certain schools that are born. For instance, the medical school of Salerno in southern Italy, that never became a university, but it was something pretty similar. And that was an extremely advanced center that had basically collected the knowledge of all these traditions coming from the East, and that, however, associated theory also to practice. That was the key thing about it. It wasn't just about theory. It wasn't this posh idea that only people who have studied at who knows which level, these were could say something. These were schools. People went there because they wanted to get practical knowledge, not storing books somewhere and pretending that only literates read them. And no, these people were with their hands over the patients. They experimented and all, so it was extremely important. And so I don't want to underestimate actually the importance that even the ancient models had on this, because those had been indeed quite advanced. But do not think in this sense that the medievals were inferior. Okay, never think it. So another chapter that I think it's interesting we can make fit in is the chapter on magic. This is also another important point that to make you understand, in fact, that before the scientific revolution that is the base of modern physics, people of the ancient world or the medieval world, doesn't matter, had this still pretty irrational beliefs. But the important here is understanding that these irrational beliefs, however, pushed for new things to be discovered in part. So magic was considered a science, and it was usually linked with the what else can you say? Let's start with astrology better. The study of the stars, of the celestial bodies, astrology. This had, by the way, this was born in the Near East, historically speaking, because that was, not surprisingly, back in the day, where the first civilization started, and there were enough people, there was enough surplus in the Fertile Crescent for these local sovereigns to invest into people to study. Actually, astrology has always been, astronomy and astrology at this point were basically the same thing, because the guys believed, they looked at the skies, so what they saw was the true stars and true celestial bodies, etc. But they still believed that those were gods and divinities. So astronomy and astrology were the same thing. And actually, it's only from this historical times that the science proper is created, because people started to write about it. But even in other primitive and illiterate people, looking at the stars had always been the first thing ever. It had informed their religion in all human civilizations. For instance, the Mongols, since we're talking about the low Middle Ages, were extremely keen, they were illiterate at the beginning. But for orienting themselves into the steppe, that could be this terrible flatland with no recognition point, they intensively used the stars. The stars deities, the celestial deities, were out there for all, especially the nomadic peoples, but not only. So, in fact, the Mongols, when they conquered the Islamic world, especially in Persia, where astronomy was quite advanced, they get immediately passionate about astronomy. So that's the first thing they want to learn, and that's why those the kingdoms the empires they form in there, eventually with the collapse of the broader Mongol Empire, keep being so advanced at this point. Astrology had actually interested also the Greek and Roman world, obviously. So it's not an irrational belief that was believed just, in the Middle Ages, because people were superstitious. People were superstitious also in the ancient age. Especially the Romans were terribly superstitious. And arguably also like all the other peoples that were out there. And astrology was connected with magic for the simple reason that it took into consideration the existence. I mean, it started from the belief that existed a relation of similitude of some sort between the structure of the universe and the one of the human being. So it was founded on the studying of these so-called spiritual intelligences that were actually located in the same celestial bodies, and through which you could access basically these superior forms of knowledge, including the one of the future. So this had been typical since the ancient world. That people, all the peoples looked at the stars and tried to figure out, because they had noticed naturally on their, they didn't know maybe that, obviously they didn't have extremely. You see, the Westerners took a while before they realizing that that it was that the Earth was not at the center of the universe, for instance. But everybody had realized, however, the fact that was a cyclicity attached to these big astronomic movements and all. So they started saying, okay, certain things will repeat over and over again. Actually, the Westerners at this point were Christians, so Christianity didn't really buy into this. We will see how the church reacted to this eventually, to these sciences. but they had a linear conception of time. This was usually exceptional in human civilizations, because most of human civilizations have a cyclical idea of time. And this is based exactly on these astronomic beliefs. And so, since the ancient world was this idea that you could foresee the future through the movements of the stars, through the horoscopes, when you were born, where the celestial bodies were placed at the moment of your birth, and this was actually pretty standard also in medieval times. Even into Christianity, actually, if you read any chronicle from the Middle Ages, there is always something said about, I don't know, that year there was this calamity because, I don't know, Mars was in conjunction with Mercury. I don't know how to say that, but they truly believed that. It was a sort of we'll say it now better, how it was integrated actually with the other beliefs, including the religious ones, especially the religious ones. So, especially the Westerners were extremely attracted by these beliefs, and for instance, the Cathedral School of Chartres in France was extremely precocious in getting interested into magics. So we're talking about a cathedral school, so where priests studied. Okay, not only but chiefly it was for forming clergymen there. So magics was already in there. But even the courts, even the secular courts, this is very important, especially during the 13th century, started hosting a lot of Arab astrologers, trying to figure out this. Recently I was talking about Frederick II, think about Palermo, for instance, and Sicily. This was the most important court during the 13th century, and it was full of Arabs and Jews as well, because the Jews also had this. They developed pretty much. Think later about the Kabbalah, for instance, and all these. The whole medieval world was kind of soaked with these beliefs, and all these wisdoms coming together from different cultures were very important. So especially secular rulers. Frederick II was accused of being a sort of an heretic, partly also because of this great intellectual thirst that is what really characterizes the Middle Ages. Never think that this is also another point to understand. The medievals were the people that in all history had the greatest thirst and inexhaustible thirst of knowledge. Okay, in the Enlightenment, the main problem was not actually knowing things, but find a category to classify them. Those who were obsessed by knowledge were really the medievals, even more than the ancients. That had a very different approach in this sense. The medievals thought that the world had to be understood. It was a moral duty. It was an ethical mission, say, also wanted by God as well, always within certain tracks. And this is, in fact, through these astrologers that also magic comes back in the West from antiquity, say from ancient times, and eventually keeps developing much later, actually through the Renaissance. Even part of the so-called scientific revolution occurred during the Renaissance, in a world where scientists were on average alchemists, for instance. They believed in magic. They had this mixed belief. So even the Renaissance, that is, this moment in which the superstition ended the Dark Middle Ages, not at all. The Renaissance was one of the, actually is the apex of this occult beliefs. And there are indeed more complex systems of conceiving the world, especially this polymatic approach that today doesn't exist anymore, because today we're all kind of expert in our own field. But at the time, scientists were people who studied literally everything that existed at the time in knowledge. Okay, and don't say, oh well, but yeah, because there was less to know. Actually, today, even as experts, we know much less in proportion that what those guys really studied, quantitatively speaking. Okay, so they were huge minds. Also, another thing we didn't stress today, I think it's very, very important also to understand medieval technology is really the way these people learned. I mean, today nobody learns by heart anymore. When I went to school as a kid of the 90s, I was still taught to learn something by heart, like a poem, or a song, or stuff like that. And that was already pretty narrow. Today, kids do not do that anymore. They stay just with these iPhones in their hands, and they get everything immediately. So their memory basically shrinks in size. In the Middle Ages, there was no other way to learn, to access knowledge, because even the material supports on which knowledge was written and preserved were pretty costly. So it was a combination of factors that brought these people actually to learn by heart huge amount of texts. Many people think this is typical of the Renaissance scholars, because we have seen that the Renaissance had this huge surplus of wealth to dedicate to studies. So there were greater thinkers in this sense that had the chance, the possibility of studying. So there are certain geniuses that are born, but that are not given the possibility to study, just like today. Thinking about in developing world, how many new Michelangelo or Leonardo we have that, however poor, they live into slums, they can't study, and they are lost for the benefit of human civilization, and that's a shame. So this happened partly also in the Middle Ages, also in military history. That's something I discussed. There were sometimes this prejudice that in the Middle Ages there weren't great commanders. This is false, but sometimes it was just environmental situations that triggered that. In the Middle Ages there were surely many Hannibals, many Caesars, but maybe because of the political fragmentation of Europe, like they couldn't wage war with large armies and to carry out extremely complicated tactics, they had to stick to that, but they still existed. So think always about the context, because that's really what matters when you tell these stories. So I don't remember what I was getting here. The learning by heart. For instance, it was normal for priests to learn the whole Bible by heart. Now, I don't know if you you have ever read the whole Bible. Well, I can assure you it takes a lot. And these guys, just read it. These guys knew it by heart entirely. So maybe these people didn't know else. As we have seen, they didn't have a notion of how physics worked. They believe in superficial stuff, but actually, my God, they knew the whole Bible by heart. Now, it takes an exceptional mind to do that, and actually, this is not even true, because we got so used. This is another modernistic prejudice in which I just fell. The idea of learning the Bible by heart is so difficult, because as moderns, we're not used to do such things anymore, but actually the human mind can do that if you train it since an early age. If you get educated in a certain fashion, you're perfectly capable of doing that. It doesn't take a huge mind. It takes just a human mind. So you see even how human knowledge is so flexible. You can't say, oh, these people in history were more stupid than the others. No, you have to understand the context. You have to understand the context. Because if you don't do that, you can't judge. And it doesn't even make a sense to judge, to compare. If you want to compare the Middle Ages with other eras, you have to understand that it partly doesn't make sense. Because for understanding the Middle Ages, you have to understand the Middle Ages. You can't say, okay, this was better or worse than other ages. It was simply different. And actually, what humans did during the Middle Ages sometimes was outstanding. Never think to be more intelligent or more skilled than, let's say, I don't know, a Bulgar knight of the 9th century. Because you're not. And don't indulge into this myth that modern people are intelligent. We aren't, as a matter of fact. We're just better educated. So we get this structured knowledge that we can access in easy ways, and also because we have easy lives. Up to the last century, people didn't get educated. Today we can. Also thanks to them who break their backs, I don't know, into working, into building our own world. Which you might say it's not a great world, but I mean, at least we live in the best way we've been living in world history. So I think it's pretty meaningful anyway. But also in here I lost the point. But that's the point. Never think you're better, because if you're born in this time, most likely you are not. Okay. Now, this is why, today we get a broader education, a more structured education. But that's a trick, because the informations are already prepared. So it just takes to take that knowledge and to study it. Have you ever thought about it? When you open a book of physics and you start learning all the various laws, etc., you're studying something like that took millennia before it could be figured out. And you come here freshly with this printed book in an industrial civilization. You just read it, okay, I've learned that point, and close that. That took millennia of force. It took the lives of millions. It took the sweat and tears and blood of millions to arrive to that book. So every time you open a book, be thankful for being able to do it in the first place. And never think that the people who came before you were worse than you, because you owe them everything you have. Almost everything you have. And so ancient people were more ignorant, but they were at least more intelligent in the sense that they could solve more complex problems in a shorter time that today we couldn't. Okay. We were born as from hunter-gatherers, essentially. Hunter-gatherers had, and still have, because there are still hunter-gatherers in the world somewhere, certain knowledge that was that allowed them to survive. That today, if we were left in their own same environment, we would personally starve to death. Okay. So never underestimate, and this is also another point, never underestimate people. Do not think it takes a book for a person to know what to do. Because historically speaking, it doesn't. Erase this modernistic prejudices from your mind when you study history, because that's not how history happened. So going on in a less emphatic way. So, talking about magic, we were talking about magic. So magic is about was part, let's say, at the time of the sciences that were aimed at knowledge of the relation of mankind and between mankind and the universe, essentially. But it was believed, especially through the learning of certain formulae and rites and gestures and sounds, and even of drawings and colors. So it was very multi-dimensional, really, that it was possible to attract certain spiritual intelligence that populated the cosmos and basically obliged them to put at the service of the magician their power and their knowledge. So this was the general idea, and we have to think that magic in this sense was probably much more spread as knowledge than we can imagine. Even in those environments that are usually thought, from a modernistic perspective, once again, to have been opposed to it. For instance, the church. So the church, for instance, definitely condemned these activities, because the church considered such spiritual intelligence as angels rebel to God, therefore to demons, and therefore both magics and astrology were basically associated to heresies, and just like this one, persecuted. But it's still very important now to understand that it was still believed to be true. Now, this is not something you can give for granted. I mean, the church wasn't saying, okay, this is completely false, so we don't care about it. It's just fairy tale, and we don't care. This is what the church starts to do into the Renaissance, actually. By the end of the 16th century, already the Roman Church believed, for instance, that witchcraft was fairy tale, while in the Protestant world, even up to the 18th century, women were burned at the stake and stuff like that. So just for telling you, even this terribly evil church, that it wasn't nor terrible nor evil as we picture it. But the important thing, at least in this time, in the Low Middle Ages, is that the church still believed in the actual existence of these forces. They were saying they are demons, they are angels that are rebel to God, that exist in the universe and that cause these things. So this, first of all, equated to accepting that this was true, to acknowledging it. So people believed in it, even in the church. Secondly, this is pretty interesting, because if you believe in it, you always have the temptation of making it work. Magic was so attractive because people believed that it worked, that it could have practical effects, and this went on so many levels. So also in here, there was this more sophisticated, systematic thought that was also taken from the East, that you have to think in popular culture that magic had always existed in there. This existed since polytheism, and even before. So the church, even think about the evangelization of Europe, how much it took before making, especially the rural population, actually to make them stop believing into these pagan rites, essentially, that were magic in practice, and were considered as such. But such beliefs still remained. I mean, we know it, right? Even still today. I personally don't like Wiccans or these other kind of neo-pagan movements, because they're all but actually following what real paganism was. These are just people who want to get, who pretend to know history, and they don't most of the times, and they commit some of the worst historical atrocities, even insulting the same memory of the pagans that they're trying to emulate, simply because they don't understand, they never studied history of religions in the first place. But it's indeed true that a lot of beliefs that, their idea is that basically this pagan world is being destroyed, but there is someone who has survived, and magic still flows in there, and that paganism is, I mean, they don't all believe in magic. I don't know why I'm getting into this because it's very risky. But they basically, because once I had a debate with a I don't know whether she was a Wiccan, but she was kind of defending the Wiccans, because she told me that, and I told her that most of the pagan knowledge is lost, and this person wanted to make me believe that basically neo-pagans are the direct continuation of ancient paganism. Actually, they aren't. They have reinvented it from scratch, and most of the times they don't know anything they're talking about. But I can acknowledge, however, that there are lots of beliefs in our world, in our supposedly secular, modernized world, that are really still based on such beliefs. if you go especially into the less developed areas of Europe or other places, people believe in magics still. I mean, and they're schooled. They read. They even have scientific knowledge, but maybe they're still obsessed by the horoscopes or by the other black occult knowledge. And there are many people. We call it superstition sometimes. That I agree, and it might be a bit offensive in this sense, because I personally I don't believe in superstition as such, but I realize that part of our culture has it. And even myself, actually, that there are certain things I don't really believe, but that I need emotionally to comfort me sometimes. Not many, actually, and they are pretty light things, and I don't believe in them. I'm a pretty rational person, I believe, for today's standards. At least I hope. But those are actually the legacy of those words. So we don't have to be so skeptical, even in here, thinking that in our world this doesn't exist anymore. Because actually many rites, many traditions still keep that, and if you believe in them, that automatically makes you part of that. And so it's personally it's also interesting because it has a lot of anthropology in it, and I think it's very fascinating to study, even sociologically speaking. So I wanted to tell you another story. It's an anecdote, actually. It's a legend about Al-Mamun. This extremely educated caliph of Baghdad who founded the House of Wisdom, this university. In Arab, it was called Bayt al-Ikma. I think it's pronounced. So Al-Mamun is this. I named it in that video I mentioned also before. I just made a few days ago about 12th century 9th to 12th century Islamic thought. He was an Abbasid caliph, probably the most important figure from a cultural point of view. And the legend tells basically that Al-Mamun, he ruled from 809 to 833. Al-Mamun dreamed Aristotle. So, by the way, the Arabs were totally in love with classical knowledge. Actually, in the Islamic world, figures like Aristotle, especially, are much more revered today than in the West, which is kind of paradoxical, but it's really part of that phenomenon I was hinting at before. That is, the Arabs came really literally out of the desert, and in a few generations, basically, they controlled, even if they eventually broke down. I mean, from the Atlantic Ocean to China, basically. So they didn't have cultural resistance. They came in contact, especially into the Near East, into the Byzantine lands, with this huge knowledge of classical knowledge that they immediately poured into their minds. They had the myth, for instance, that they destroyed the Library of Alexandria is a myth, and it was created actually by the same Arabs for one reason, because these caliphs, when they invaded Egypt, they wanted to show to be perfect Muslims, and saying that they didn't have, so radically that they didn't have basically to read any other book but the Quran. Telling the truth, there is no proof they destroyed the Library of Alexandria. It probably had already been destroyed, by the way, by other fires before. But on the contrary, the Arabs immediately seized all this classical knowledge because they believed, as a matter of fact, we're talking about magic, right? These people believed in the actual power that knowledge had. They treasured it. and they absorbed it so much that in the great Arab civilization, this actually came to have all these great effects. As we were saying before, actually, this recovery of the ancient works from in the West actually owes much more to the Arabs than to the Byzantines, in part. Also because the Arabs had this greater multicultural world, so that actually they weren't just taking classical knowledge, they were also absorbing the one of Persia. There was also this huge civilization, millenary civilization, of India as well. Now we will see mathematics, how advanced it was with Al-Khwarizmi. We'll say it now. But going back to Al-Mamun's dream, he dreamed of Aristotle, and he decided at this point to translate, according to religion of course, to translate in Arab all the works of this great Greek philosopher, and founding his university for this very reason. Now, among the scholars that worked into the House of Wisdom at the University of Baghdad, there was the mathematician Mohammed Al-Khwarizmi. That is someone we basically owe a lot, if anything, because he wrote his treatise on the calculus system that today we call Indo-Arabic, based on the so-called Arabic ciphers and the introduction of the zero of Indian origin. That is the base of our modern mathematics. So Al-Khwarizmi is actually an extremely fascinating figure, because, by the way, all these great scholars of the Abbasid Caliphate were actually, only a few of them were actually Arab, and what you notice is that lots of them were actually Persian, simply because Persia was this sort, while the Arabs were basically absorbing everything from the others, because they, in Arabia, as semi-nomads, they hadn't developed this extremely developed thinking at all. That's something only sedentary civilizations produce. Persia was one of those civilizations, and it was extremely influential on Iraq at the time, the center of Abbasid rule. And they came from this world of today's, not just today's Iran. Al-Khwarizmi was actually born into Khiva, that is today's, I think, Uzbekistan, and that is just beyond Turkmenistan, I think, in north of Iran. That was the soul called Khwarezmia. So Al-Khwarizmi actually means this, that he was a Khwarezmian. So this area of the world that at the time, Al-Khwarizmi he lived in the 10th century, but later it was destroyed by the Mongols, but actually it had some of the most populated cities of the world at that time, and very few people know that Merv, for instance, I think it's in today's Uzbekistan, now there are only the ruins because the Mongols razed it to the ground, but it was the most populated city of the globe. That was a very ancient settlement, also an Alexandrine colony. So it was a world in here between the east and, east you had China, pretty close, at least the Chinese, trying to China passed from there. Then you had the steppes in the north, then you had in the south Persia, then in the west you had Europe and the Near East. So it was an extremely prolific area in terms of cultural hybridation. So Al-Khwarizmi was an extraordinary figure, and he was a polymath. As we were saying before, we normally remember him as a mathematician because of the introduction of the Indian then known as eventually today known as Arabic ciphers, but he was also an astronomer, that is a bit what we were talking about before, relatively to astrology and magic and all. He was a geographer, also a chronographer. So he was, you understand, these 360 degrees intellectual minds. And he lived mostly in Baghdad, so the center of, he went from Khwarizmia to there. He let us know that he was from Khwarizmia, and then he found as a great mind his place at the Abbasid University. So his works comprehend also other, I don't know how to say that, but basically a reshaping of the atlas and of Ptolemy's atlas and geographies. This was done on the base of the Greek text. Then Al-Khwarizmi wrote his treatise of algebra that is actually the most ancient of the all, at least existing still today in Arab, written in Arab. And he also composed certain astronomic tables with an explicative text that actually was based on of an Indian treatise of astronomy, the so-called Siddhanta, and to which he added notes in Arab with the name of Sindh. And so his greatest fame came from his algebra treatise, and he was extremely important, so very important for the development of this subject. And as a matter of fact, a few people think about it, but the term algorithm actually it's a Latinization of the name Al-Khwarizmi. You might think that algorithm is one of these words that come from, I don't know, ancient Greek, and who knows which etymology they have. Actually, it comes from the Latinization of the term, because when these works arrived in the West, they were immediately Latinized, as Latin was the language of culture, of education. So at a certain point in Rome, there was even an office in the Papal Curia that was proposed for the Latinization of all the names that came from other languages, which sometimes are even very funny to read because they were adapted in even changing the sense, radically the etymology of the word. And so algorithm comes from him, and the term is basically this calculus scheme till today as a word. So Al-Khwarizmi actually didn't go beyond quadratic equations. That is the second grade equations. But basically, so he stopped to what the Greeks had done. So we're talking about Euclides or Diophantus, and but there is, however, and this is also a very important medieval character that also characterizes especially these great Islamic thinkers, that in spite of, and this is important for what I was telling before relatively to the relation between the ancient and medieval knowledge, that even if the medievals took back this knowledge from classical times and essentially didn't go beyond it more than much, but they, in the reacquisition of these classical notions, you can always see an extremely strong thought of original reelaboration. So you understand that these people not just copied passively this knowledge at all, as we were saying at the beginning of the video. They were essentially thinking through it already at the point of reformulating it in different ways. So as a strictly technological phenomenon, this means that you have to think that also society produces such knowledge because of the practical use that it's gonna make of it. Which means that, as we were saying before as well, such a part of this knowledge was also largely theoretical. I mean, not all of it was actually applied. Some of these scholars and thinkers were so ahead for their times that some of their knowledge was mostly theoretical. It didn't find a big deal of application but a great deal of implementation actually rather than application, because it was also applied. These things were used indeed, but they couldn't, for the technological potential of those times, to make, you know, an extreme, to trigger I don't know, a scientific revolution, because simply the society of that time didn't have the basis for that to happen. This is very, very important. You have to understand technology to being chained unavoidably to the material potential that you have. Just like today, as we were saying before, we have a lot of knowledge, but we can't apply it all. Think about spatial missions. Yeah, we have the technology on the Earth to do great things actually, but we don't have the resources now to colonize, for instance, other planets, because it would cost an awful lot with today's current technology. And I think that until we want to fix hydrogen, I don't think we will ever even have the potential to colonize other planets, as a matter of fact, on a massive scale. Because even if we have an advanced technology, we don't have the energy. This is physics. This is the second principle of dynamics. So also in here, in the Middle Ages, not having that potential, they couldn't, it wasn't even worth to overdevelop, to go beyond even those knowledge in some measure. And that tells you, by the way, how the ancient and the medieval worlds were actually similar and homogeneous, even in potential. We're talking about pre-industrial times, so these were extremely, these were the peaks, if you want, of pre-industrial societies in many ways, and that's what they could produce. And as a matter of fact, it's only, however, in the 16th century that the mathematicians, the algebraists of the school of Bologna in Italy, so here we are in the core of the Renaissance, they finally provided a solution for the equation, the third grade equations. So going past the quadratic equations in this sense, and therefore surpassing also Al-Khwarizmi's mathematics. But up to that point, so from the 10th century to the 16th, so we're talking about 700 years here, mathematics had stopped to that. Okay? And this is important to understand, and because, well, I explained it why, but it's important to remember it. It's important to fix it in mind, to understand how our societies work. So to conclude today, this rather long video, I will talk you about the figure of Leonardo Fibonacci. So also in here I have prepared, as you can see in the background picture, this is a manuscript from the Liber Abaci of Leonardo Fibonacci. So the Liber Abaci in Latin means the abacus book. You can see here there are numbers and all. So what was Leonardo Fibonacci? So he was born in Pisa, so he was a Tuscan in 1180. He was born from a public scribe that worked the service of the city's government. So we're talking about this very peculiar class of Italian notaries and chiefly that worked into the communal offices. So this is very important to tell you also about how even such figures come out, because if Italy at that point hadn't had these cities with a central government, with this bureaucracy, with this administration, even this human material would have, it's not really that. It's really about the fact that Italy was wealthy, was literate, and therefore people could study and could even have such jobs like a public scribe, a public notary. So Leonardo's father was sent to Bugia by the peasant government. Bugia is in Algeria, and the peasants at this time were extremely involved into the Western Mediterranean trade. And Bugia was a trade center on the Mediterranean coast, so the peasants had big economical interests in there, and they sent these officials. By the way, this is very interesting because these officials usually worked in the local quarters of the cities that were given by the local governments to the Italians, because they basically these Italian merchants worked as a spin-off for economical growth at that time. They were traders, so they were in charge of transforming these quarters, usually close to the ports, into these trade centers between the hinterland and the sea, and they made a lot of money thanks to that. And naturally, a big deal of this relation also implied cooperation with the local government. So in Algeria, the local government was Muslim, and the peasants, by the way, had harshly fought against the Saracens and had basically kicked them out of the Western Mediterranean, together with the Genoese. But they still kept trading. This is the normal business. When the Muslims invaded the southern Mediterranean shores, people from the northern Mediterranean shores kept trading with them. There was warfare, was endemic, but there was trade as well, also because these Islamic and Christian worlds were fragmented, so they were also often one against the other, and there was a lot of political dynamism into this, so that you could trade with someone to weaken another person, another political entity. Christians and Muslims even traded together with each other against for going against other religionaries. So this was daily business. So Fibonacci was raised into this multi-ethnic environment, and he traveled a lot. Another key to understand this process of Western acculturation, let's say, it passes through understanding the Westerns traveled a lot. Leonardo Fibonacci, as an Italian merchant, let's say, traveled extensively. He was in Egypt, in Syria, in Greece. So he came back into Italy into the first years of the 13th century, and he elaborated certain writings that he had that were relatively to all what he had learned overseas. So he basically wrote in this process a lot, really about a lot of theory and a lot of practice of mathematics. And the Liber Abaci was published in 1202. And what is the Liber Abaci? Actually, it's a sort of encyclopedia of algebra. And one of the most important thing about it is that he basically took with that in the West, he introduced through that in the West the Arabic ciphers. So if we use Arabic ciphers on our keyboards, that happened through India, Mohammed Al-Khwarizmi, and Leonardo Fibonacci. So you understand even the geographical dimension of this. Even India had been through trade through the Middle and Near East has always been connected to the Mediterranean since Roman times. So and up to China through that route. And so you have to think about people going back and forth trading. Italians were going to China at this point. So not just remaining into the Mediterranean, just also faring as far as China at this point, and passing through the Arab world, passing through India, and learning lots of stuff. This wasn't the case of Leonardo Fibonacci, but others would do that, and especially these Italian merchants really knew each other, so they talked about it, what they had seen, and they were interested into getting a practical something that could help them, actually, mostly in their in their business. We will see it now. So in the Liber Abaci you find also to be introduced the equations, the arithmetic and geometric progressions. So lots of things. Actually, probably you've heard Fibonacci because of the Fibonacci code, the sequence. So that's also another thing. We can explain it later, but the most important thing is the broader picture of it and the cultural, dynamism that lays behind that. So in 1220, Fibonacci also published another work that is called Practica Geometry, which in Latin means the practice of geometry, where he developed certain problems of Euclidean geometry. So that's also what you learn in high school normally. So the most important thing about Fibonacci in here is that we don't have to understand his interest as a mere purely scientific interest. Okay, so once again, my warning: do not fall into the trick of thinking that these people were interested about science in that world. It didn't start from that. There wasn't this division between knowledge and let's say abstract knowledge and reality. It was all one thing. Okay? Today we have theorized maths, we have theorized physics. We know how to apply it as well. But it's really part of our system of education, of an extremely complex society that needs this form of it. At the time, this did not exist. This came from sheer utilitarianism, say, from these people who needed practical knowledge. So Fibonacci was interested in this sense, not in drawing this theoretical picture of algebra, but actually to curb algebra also in part, in his treatises, to his practical needs of trade. for instance, all these notions, even in the books of Fibonacci, you find a lot of examples that basically showed the reader how these mathematical notions could be used into solving concrete problems. For instance, in money changing, or in selling and buying, and all these things. Okay, so this is very important also because after Fibonacci, especially in the 14th century, there was a lot of treatises written on the so-called manuals, let's say on the practices of trade. So these were manuals essentially. You had a very, once again, a very pragmatic reason for being written, and you cannot understand that if you don't know what Fibonacci was writing as well. Another thing was cartography. For instance, according to you, why did cartography was created? Because people wanted a theoretical picture of the world, like we are used today with our global maps, just in there into the classrooms for kids to watch them. No, they need that for trade as well. In fact, one of the most fascinating things about cartography, and the Italians were pioneering cartography as well this time, is that this is beautiful about cartography. It really makes you understand about technology. That before these times, actually the medievals didn't need maps. They didn't. They had certain written itineraries that equated to, I don't know, I have to reach a place. How do I get there? So the map would be a written thing, like, I don't know, you go 50 miles north, then you turn at that mountain, and then you go out of 20 miles east, then you cross a bridge, and then there is a plain, and then another bridge, and after you another river, and while you cross the bridge, you do other 10 miles and you arrive to that city. That was a map, let's say. And the interesting thing is that the Romans didn't have either. If you look at the Roman maps of the world, they were something extremely imprecise. And you don't have to think at that like, oh, the Romans were stupid or the ancients were stupid because they how could they do? They had made these maps that are all wrong, so they took the wrong path, simply because they didn't use those maps to move. There were other ways to move, like these itineraries that in fact the Romans used. I mean, if you had to send an army somewhere, you didn't care really to have a spatial vision of how it was. It only took you to know how long it took to go through that road, and you can ask locals. You obviously in the empire, the Romans already knew what their distances were, their times of percurrence, but that's all they needed. What was the practical point of needing a map of the empire? There wasn't. And this is what we're very, very silly not to recognize in our modern point of view, because we are so used to our world that we can't understand the ones of those who came before us. So why do the Italians and the Aragonese start to create these maps during the lower Middle Ages that start to be effectively detailed and with real dimensions and corrected? So, because the other medieval maps had been very symbolical. They were not really maps. They were ideal depictions of how the world was, especially based on the Bible, and they were very stylized in many ways. They were pretty simple things, and just to say that the most important thing was for the Christians to know where the East was, because that's where the holy places were, and that's where that was the direction from which Christ would have come, essentially. A bit like, not much differently from, in fact, churches were built in also on this fashion. So the reason why cartography gets better is that at that point merchants had to rationalize, giving the increase in trade traffics and volumes, etc. They needed to create a a depiction of the coastal areas to know how the coast was made, if there were bays, gulfs, harbors, ports, etc. In fact, the extremely interesting fact about these first maps is that the only correct part of them is actually the coastal areas. I mean, the distances in the continent, in the hinterland, are completely false. But not even false, but they simply didn't care to trace them, because if they had to take a land itinerary, they would have taken other measures. Okay, that's where cartography is born, and that was progressively expanded at the point eventually in the Renaissance there is this full cartographs. Think about Mercator or others that eventually even began to draw these pictures of the globe without, by the way, knowing that much about the rest of the globe. You think that the Oceania was basically discovered into the 18th century, even if obviously the Westerners had figured out that there was probably something else in there. Simply, they hadn't still looked at that. And why? Because they didn't care, because at that point the trades, what really mattered for them was elsewhere. So maybe someone had ventured that even before Cook or others, but simply they hadn't, humans had always crossed in there. From southern Asia, people had always reached pretty far into America, into Australia. So the idea is humans adapt chiefly for their needs, and they don't do things that are inconvenient. Of course, modern economics is based on the idea that the so-called Homo economicus, that is the perfect economical man that makes always rational choices based on mathematical thing, does not exist, because definitely we are, as humans, extremely rational in many ways. So even the marketing and advertisements and all are all shaped to kind of take advantage of essentially of human gullibility, of irrationality, or emotions and all. But generally speaking, these great massive structural dynamics, like the expansion of a civilization from a technological point of view, always have certain logical and rational tracks. So if you ever thought in your life, why did people in the past did this, where they did something that at least to you sounds like weird, the answer, especially for these big events, is most of the times these people had figured out already the best way to do it at the time. So you have to learn in turn from them other things that you are evidently ignoring, because if you can't understand that in the first place and you find that weird, you're basically ignoring what the problem was, and you ignore a lot about their history. So never fall into, I'll say that again, never fall into this prejudice to be, better than those who lived in the past. So we could talk about Fibonacci at this point, but I don't know how you would appreciate. As a matter of fact, relatively to Fibonacci's numeric succession, like for instance the Fibonacci was quite keen on fractions, basically especially this composition of an ordinary fraction into a sum of simple fractions. So that were all different from each other, and especially having the unity as a numerator. For instance, if you do 11 over 12 equates to 1 over 2 plus 1 over 3 plus 1 over 12. So even from the numerical succession of, say, of 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, etc., into which every element is equal to the sum of the two preceding ones, and Fibonacci had created this, curiously, just to tell you how these things happen, to study the descendancy, essentially the breeding of a couple of rabbits. And it's known, in fact, as succession of Fibonacci. So what was Fibonacci caring about? About how rabbits reproduced and how their population could expand. Now that's also a legitimate concern. If you're breeding rabbits and you want to sell them, that's important. And so all these questions about algebra and geometry, they're definitely important. And so in this process, Fibonacci definitely used certain informations from the elements of Euclides. For instance, for the geometrical representation of the quantities, but he also used the so-called Liber Imbandorum of Abraham ben Ihar. That was known as in the West as Abraham Judaeus, so Jew. There is also Fibonacci also carried out, and you can see here, the sort of also algebraical symbolism. For instance, you find certain abbreviations for the words radix, census, and numerus to indicate the unknown. For instance, it's square and a given number. So there is also a deal of this tells you that there was a very practical, was a very dynamic use of these numbers at the point of needing such abbreviations, such symbolisms, etc. So he also solved squared equations, like we've seen from Al-Khwarizmi's maths of the 10th century, and he also, at this time there were already mathematical debates. Some were revolving especially into around the court of Frederick II, who also got interested about it. So it's all very important things that have not just, as we were saying, a mathematical, pure theoretical mathematical aims, but also its application in a technical and commercial fashion, for writing accounts, for even explaining a lot about money, how they worked, the debates on the intrinsic value of money, in contraposition to the dominating theories about the money sign thing. So, well, now probably these are meaningless things for most of you, but let's say that it was there's a lot of dynamism here, and I will conclude by remembering, in fact, that the medievals didn't just passively took this information from the ancient world. They enhanced that for their own practical needs. So they were already thinking them on their own, in some measure. We're able to, you're not, a very important point in technological advancement is, that I always talk about also when I deal with military history, is that very often our stupid modernistic mind states certain things like, oh, that people took that technology, let's say, from that other. So it was inferior because it had to be taught that by that other people. This is also completely false in history of technology, because in history of technology, you have to know that knowledge to apply it effectively. So if a people copies, let's say, let's use this word, a certain knowledge from other people and is able to implement it, that people is not less advanced. On the contrary, it is more advanced, because it's able to know that people has it and to recognize it as a valuable thing, to integrate it in its own civilization, and to use it for its own purpose. So it means that that people is perfectly capable of understanding that knowledge on its own. So next time you think about the Middle Ages as a moment in which the Westerners got schooled by the the ancient world, or by these Islamic or Byzantine manuscripts that otherwise, without which the West would have never gotten out of the terribly dark Middle Ages. Just know that this is pure and utter rubbish, and that nobody studies even such things anymore in this fashion. And I will definitely talk again about this. For now, I just hope I wasn't too radical in my explanation, but I care very much about this point, really. And I repeat it over and over again if necessary. And I really hope this video will serve to someone at some point. So for now, I just thank you for... I hope, first of all, as always, that you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please share it, or leave a like, or subscribe to my channel. This is my usual, let's say, commercial part. So you see that I also have practical interests as well. And I thank you heartily. However, this comes straight from the heart. Thank you heartily for listening to me. It's very, very nice from you. I see there are enough of you who are following me, and very, very glad about it. So thanks. And technology would be nothing without humanity. I think this is what I want to leave you with, because technology alone doesn't serve anything. It needs a human mind to make it work. So for now, I thank you once again for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.